Hello, everyone. If I were to stand before you and take out a pack of smokes out of my pocket right this moment and light up a cigarette, you'd probably think I'm crazy, right? Well, for starters, you can't really smoke in here. And second, we all know how dangerous smoking is. But how do we know that? These days, it is common knowledge, but it wasn't always like this. Because you see, people didn't really start smoking on a massive scale until after the First World War, and it was some years after the first automated cigarette manufacturing machine was invented. And it had to take a couple of decades before this knowledge, awareness about dangers of smoking became mainstream. In 1964, the Surgeon General of the United States published a report on smoking and health. And the report was quite clear that smoking is deadly. Yet it wasn't until a couple more decades before this became mainstream. But why am I telling you this? Well, I think we have a great example of history repeating itself, and this time it's about sitting. Because for some years now, some scientists have been saying that sitting can actually be just as harmful or even more than smoking, and not a lot of people are aware of that. So, hello again. My name is Marek Stój. I've been a software developer for more than 10 years now, but that's not really important because, as you may have probably guessed, this talk won't be really technical. Instead, I'm standing before you as a fellow geek in order to tell you about, dangers of sedentariness and prolonged sitting. So let's dive right into it. How sitting kills us? So, in 2014, a book was published titled Get Up. It was written by Dr. James Levine, who is a world-renowned expert on topics like obesity, negative effects of sedentary behaviors, and the likes. And he is quite serious when he says that sitting is the new smoking. And going back to smoking for a little bit, in the year 2000, researchers wanted to somehow convey to the general public how dangerous smoking is, and so they came up with these numbers, these estimates. So they made assumptions as to when do we usually start, at what age we usually start smoking, how many cigarettes on a given day we smoke, and they came up with this estimate that one cigarette smoked might cost us 11 minutes of our lives. And during the lifespan, it might translate to 7 years lost compared to non-smokers. Now, Dr. Levine, in his book, writes that 1 hour of sitting can actually cost us 2 hours of our lives. And so I was quite shocked when I read about this and decided to do some simple math similar to that done on the smoking. So I made some assumptions as to at what age we usually start our professional careers, how long we spend sitting on our average day, and I've came up with this rough estimate of 15 years lost due to sitting. Let's keep that number in mind as we shall revisit it soon enough. Now, this idea that sitting can actually be harmful or even dangerous might seem ridiculous to you because, after all, this is a very natural thing for us. We do it all the time. But again, was it always like this? Well, not really, if we take a look at the wider horizon here, because, our ancestors, our cousins, evolved as bipeds for millions of years, and our bodies evolved for movement in an upright position. Of course, we did sit, but it was more as means to resting after hours of exploration, hunting, and a bit later, after hours of agricultural work. Now, going back to our current times, so you can say that around 60 to 70 years ago, this so-called digital revolution has started. And with it came the era of computers and office work. In the 1960s, it was still estimated that around 50% of jobs require at least a moderate amount of movement. But like an example can be a person working at a production line at a factory. But it is now estimated that in the 21st century, more than 80% of jobs translate to sitting on our buttocks all day long, and the trend continues. But the problem is, the jobs is not the only problem here, because if we take an honest look at our average day, right? So we get up, we sit to have our breakfast, we sit in our cars, on a bus or on a tram while we commute. Then, of course, we sit in front of our computers. We go back, we sit in front of a TV. When we go to a doctor, what is usually the very first thing that we do? We look for some place to sit down. And it is really bad. It's been now estimated that an average American on a given day spends 8 hours sleeping, 3 hours moving, and 13 hours sitting. It is that bad. And so you might wonder where such a lifestyle can lead us. So, actually in the year 2000, we were shown quite a nice picture of how a future for us might look like if we continue with this kind of lifestyle. There was this movie titled WALL-E, and if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. So in it, we could see a picture of a society in which people are so obese and their muscles are so deteriorated that they can no longer move by themselves. So this is our future. Okay, but by now you are probably wondering what it is exactly about this sitting that is dangerous to us. So it turns out that prolonged sitting, or sedentariness in general, affects negatively both our bodies and our minds. Let's start with the body. So in 2009, a research paper was published which described a 12-year-long prospective study on a cohort of 17,000 Canadians ages 18 to 90. And what researchers have found was a statistically significant correlation between how long a given person spends sitting on his or her average day and their general mortality, as well as mortality due to cardiovascular disease, which happens to be the #1 cause of death on the list that the World Health Organization publishes. And the numbers that you see here, so for people who spent most of their days sitting, they had 50% higher risk of dying. And let's be honest, it's probably most of us here are in this group. But this is just an example, right? It's one study. It turns out that over the last 2-3 decades, there were multiple studies which link sedentariness to a multitude of different health problems, disease. Dr. Levine, in his book, even has something that he calls an alphabet of sitting illnesses, and the list is quite long. We won't be going over all of them. I just wanted to point out a few of them. So naturally, probably when we think about sitting for hours at a time, we think about problems with the spine, the back pain. But this is just for starters. Sedentariness has also been linked to hypertension, colon cancer, diabetes, and type 2 diabetes and obesity, which are kind of a plague of our civilization, heart attack, various musculoskeletal disorders, and so on and so on. But this is not everything, because let us now think about what sedentariness can actually do to our brains or to our mental health. So it should be pretty common knowledge by now that movement or physical activity in general is very good for our brains. Right? For example, it's been shown that just taking a walk can improve our cognitive functions and creativity. And they knew that even in ancient times. Aristotle, for example, so he founded this school which was called a peripatetic school because there was this common practice of walking back and forth during lectures or during different disputes on scientific and philosophical matters. So what happens when we sit down? Well, for starters, we might become grumpy. You probably all know this phrase of grumpy programmer or a grumpy IT support guy. So, sitting can actually be one of the reasons for existence of such a phrase. When we sit down, we become sad. We might even become angry or depressed. And we definitely get stressed out because it's been shown that just sitting down increases the levels of cortisol, the stress hormone. And Dr. Levine observes that one of the problems of our modern world is that when we get stressed out, instead of getting up and running, we sit down and we eat. So I hope that I was able to show you that a lot of these so-called civilization diseases can actually be traced back to sedentary behaviors. And of course, there are other factors at play here, like poor nutrition or lack of sleep, but I think we can all agree that prolonged sitting is the major contributor to early deaths across the world. So a natural question arises: is there anything that we can do about it? The good news is that the answer is yes. But before we get to that, I have some bad news for those of you who might think that these kind of problems don't concern you, because you already know about this, and you do some kind of sports, you regularly go to a gym, you physically exercise in your leisure time. But that's the problem. It's been shown that just doing this kind of thing in your leisure time is just not enough to negate all the negative effects that accumulate for sitting for long hours. And in order to convince ourselves that this is actually the case, let's go back to this Canadian study that I told you about. So what we see here are the so-called hazard ratios. So hazard ratio is a term from statistics and epidemiology, which in our context here we can interpret as a relative risk of dying, depending on how much time we spend sitting on our average day. So the darker the bar, the more time a person spends sitting. And for example, a value of a hazard ratio of 1.5 means 50% higher risk of dying in such a group. What is important here is that we have two diagrams, because one stratification that researchers did was they divided people into two groups, inactive and active. That is those who declared that they do some regular physical exercise in their leisure time. And when you compare the absolute values of hazard ratios in these groups, those for the inactive are a bit higher. But the thing is that even in the active group, the trend is still there. And so even if you are active or lead this active life, but you spend almost all your day sitting, then people from this group during this study had 40% higher risk of dying. And there's also a myth now that I wanted to debunk, which is ergonomic chairs. So you might have heard about this company, Herman Miller. They produced this quite famous Aeron chair, which is famous because a lot of people say that this is the most comfortable chair in the world. But the thing with ergonomic chairs is that they were created and designed not to be healthy. They were designed to be comfortable. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're healthy, because when we sit down, one of the bad things that happen is that our core muscles, abdominal muscles and back muscles, which are supposed to stabilize our spine and maintain a posture, they simply shut down because we have our back supported. They don't have anything to do. And we know that a muscle, if not used, deteriorates with time. The funny thing is that even Herman Miller admits that, because in 2013 they published an article. It was titled "Sit, Stand, Move, and Repeat." In this article they said, and I'll try to quote, that the causal chain between prolonged sitting and potential health risks exists even if a person sits in an ergonomic, highly adjustable chair. So I guess it has to be something up if even the chair manufacturer says things like these. But that brings us a bit closer to the solution, which is we simply have to move more, but not just in our leisure time. We have to move more throughout the whole day. So, you might think, that we would need gyms in every office and do regular workouts, which, by the way, is not a really bad idea, but this is not what I have in mind right now. In order to understand what I do have in mind, we have to talk about this thing called NEAT, which stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This is the topic that Dr. Levine and others have been studying for many, many years now. So what is this thermogenesis? Very briefly, it's a set of processes that happen within bodies of all warm-blooded animals, and that, of course, includes humans, which produce heat. And there are three basic types of thermogenesis. The first one is diet-induced. After we have a meal, our body starts producing, using, and storing energy. The second type is related to physical exercise. When we physically exercise, we burn calories. And the third type, this non-exercise activity thermogenesis, is the energy expenditure due to all other activities. Turns out that due to trivial activities like just taking your dog for a walk or gardening, even doing the dishes or cleaning up your apartment, it is like on a metabolic rate chart, it is like the long tail. And Dr. Levine and other scientists have shown that throughout the day, the amount of calories that we burn due to such activities can actually add to a substantial amount. So I hope that you're getting this thing about the importance of natural movement. So in order to reinforce it, I wanted to talk a bit about this project called Blue Zones. So a couple of years ago, this guy named Dan Bittner, which is a National Geographic Fellow, together with National Institute on Aging, they set out to explore the Earth and find places where people would live significantly longer than the rest of the population. And they did just that. They found 5 such regions like Sardinia in Italy or Okinawa Islands in Japan, where the number of so-called centenarians, which is people who got to live to be 100 years old or older, to be significantly higher than the general population. And so they identified 9 common traits for these regions. They called it the Power 9. We won't be going over all of them, although I do recommend you to check out on your own this Blue Zones project. Is very interesting. What I wanted to point out is at the very top of the pyramid, which is this natural movement, or in other words, this spontaneous, non-exercise related movement. Because Dan, in his talks and in his books, he wrote and spoke that he got to talk to a lot of these centenarians. I think there were more than 200 of them. And he said that none of these people would declare that they do any kind of physical exercise, at least not in our sense of the word. Instead, physical activity and movement was naturally interwoven into the daily lives of these people. And so, you see, even though they didn't physically exercise, they still got to live, on average, 10 years longer than the rest of us. And if you remember the number from the beginning of the presentation, this rough estimate, I think I wasn't too far off, and Dr. Levine is definitely onto something here. So I do hope that you now get how important this spontaneous movement is. So if we want to incorporate more movement, more physical activity into our daily lives, we have to do something about our workplace, right? And I think that the very first step that we can do in the right direction is to simply stand up. Because the mere fact of standing increases our metabolism by around 30%. Our blood circulation improves. We tend to fidget more when we stand. Our core muscles now finally have something to do. They have to work in order to maintain our standing posture. And all this makes our need level higher during the day. And in some sense, standing is also like a gateway to other forms of movement. And I wanted to stress here that the end goal here is more movement. Not necessarily just standing, but I think that this is the very first step that we need to take, and take it from there. So, and as you probably might have guessed, I am talking about standing desks, height adjustable desks. You've probably seen them, other people working at them in a standing position. You might have even tried it yourself, but I would bet that it didn't stick, and not a lot of you do this on a regular basis. And for those who didn't try, I really, really, really urge you to at least try, and do it regularly. Now, so you might have one argument, right, which is like, what if my employer doesn't provide such equipment, right? If I don't have such desks at my office. So I wanted to tell you a story. So a few years back, I was working for a company almost 100% time remotely, and so I naturally wanted to have a nice workplace for myself at home. And I was a bit into working in a standing position back then, and so I, started a search for a height adjustable desk, this nice one, electrically adjustable. But you may imagine they were and they still are quite expensive. I was able to bring down the cost a bit by ordering the parts separately and assembling it myself, but it was still quite expensive. But it worked just fine. But after a while, I decided to switch jobs, and I had to go back to the office, right? So imagine my disappointment that there weren't any height adjustable desks. Fortunately, a couple of colleagues from an adjacent room somehow managed, to work in a standing position. They did have some kind of a setup, and the idea that they implemented, was very, very simple yet brilliant. And this is the setup that I copied. So it is just a IKEA table with a shelf attached for the keyboard put on top of a regular desk. Now, the funny thing is, we can't even compare the cost of those solutions, right? But the funny thing is that I like this IKEA do-it-yourself solution even better than my quite expensive desk at home. And I will tell you why that was. So the problem with working in a standing position is that you just won't be able to do it all day long while both maintaining proper posture and keeping your productivity. It just won't happen, and especially if you're just starting out with this. But fortunately, this is not something that researchers recommend. They actually recommend to alternate between sitting and standing. And if you're just starting with this, you should stand for, let's say, 10, 15 minutes, and then sit down for the rest of the hour, remembering also about regular breaks. And with time, you should shift this proportion in favor of standing while your body, your musculoskeletal system adapts to what it's been designed for in the first place. But the sit-stand solution also comes with a caveat. So when I was starting out and I was alternating this position between sitting and standing, I was getting distracted. So you're probably all familiar with this the concept of flow or being in the zone. So this state of mind when you're usually working on a challenging problem, yet you are so focused, very productive, you don't notice the passage of time, right? It feels great to be in this state. However, the problem with it is that it is very volatile. Even a minor distraction, like a innocent question from a colleague, will drag you out of it, and you will need some time to get back to it. And that was my experience at the beginning. I got distracted with my electrically adjustable desk. But with the do-it-yourself solution, I had two monitors, one at the top and the other on the bottom, two keyboards, a wireless mouse, and it took almost no time whatsoever to alternate between these positions, and I didn't get distracted. And that I loved. So for those of you who might want to try this out, let me repeat the parts. So the IKEA table, it's the very popular model LAC. A shelf bracket, like 80 by 30 centimeters was what I bought. 2 shelf brackets, a bunch of screws, and you're good to go. The thing is that regardless of the sit stand or standing workstation setup you might come up with, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. So the first one is that your display should be set up so that the top edge of it is aligned with your eye level. And when you place your hands on the keyboard, your arms should be bent at 90 to 100 degrees. And the third, also very important thing is that while you are doing this kind of try-ons, and then later while you are working in a standing position, you have to maintain proper posture. You just have to stand correctly. But what does that mean exactly? So in order to answer that question, let me turn to another book, which was published quite recently in 2016. Its title is Desk-Bound. There's a Polish edition. The title is Skazany na biurko. And I can't really recommend this book highly enough. It really got me deeper into this topic. I recommend it to everyone. The author is Dr. Kelly Starrett, which is quite famous CrossFit trainer, but also a physiotherapist who works with world-renowned athletes, weightlifters, martial artists, and the like. And he distills the problem of our modern times to these 3 points. One is that we just don't move enough. If we do, we're not doing that properly. We have bad patterns. And we don't regularly maintain our bodies. So we won't have time to go over all these things that the Dr. Starrett writes about. We'll focus on the second point, proper movement, which actually starts more often than not from a proper standing position. And there's this thing that Dr. Starrett describes in his book, which is called a bracing sequence, a series of steps that we can take in order to position our bodies correctly in an upright position. And so I could tell you about it, I could show you, but I have a better idea. Why don't we learn by doing? So if I wanted to ask you to stand up for like a minute or two, and we'll do it together. It's really simple. So the first step is we place our feet parallel to each other, pointing forward, right? We squeeze our gluteal muscles, that is our buttocks, and we try to screw our feet into the ground, exert an external rotation from our hips, right? We don't move the feet, we just exert this force. And this causes our pelvis to reset its position, right, and we stabilize it. The second step, in a second, we'll take a deep breath, ideally through our diaphragms, and while we exhale, we keep in mind 2 things. So one is we will tighten our abdominal muscles, we keep them tightened, and we make sure that our rib cage is positioned directly above the pelvis. Okay, so let's take a deep breath, and exhale, and keep the muscles tightened. Also keep the gluteal muscles tightened, and it doesn't have to be 100% of the power of these muscles. 20% is just enough. The third step, we're taking care of our arms. And anatomically speaking, we're doing a very similar thing as we did with our legs, which is we exert this rotation, external rotation in our shoulders, so we point our palms forward. And in the last step, we pull our head a bit, chin to the chest. And the goal here is to align our ears, shoulders, pelvis, knees, and ankles. We relax our forearms, but keeping this rotation, our thumbs pointing forward. And that's it. That is the natural, healthy standing position. Someone familiar with yoga might notice some similarities with the basic Tadasana pose. Yeah. All right, thank you. You may sit down, if you want, of course, after you've heard so much about the dangers. And that would conclude the second part of the talk. In the last part, I wanted to take a look at this topic from a different angle, I should say. So like maybe a different, wider perspective. Because when you think about it, we've been hearing that lack of movement, lack of physical activity is bad for us for many, many years now. So around 30 years after this report about smoking and health, there was another report published by the Surgeon General, and this time it was about physical activity and health. And even then, you could find statements like these, that families need to weave physical activity into their daily lives, or health professionals need to encourage their patients to get out of their chairs. Think about it. It was 1996, so more than 20 years ago now. And so tell me why our workplaces still look like this. Why the hell it seems that we're sitting ourselves to death, right? Well, I can give you a couple of reasons for that, or excuses, if you will. So for starters, lack of awareness. People are just not educated enough. It's a very similar situation as with smoking. It takes time. Second thing is that even if the awareness is there, you might say, okay, but my employer doesn't provide such equipment. But my answer to that was already provided, right? So first, it can really be cheap, literally and figuratively, to come up with your own do-it-yourself sit-stand workstation. And second, I worked for a company which hired more than 3,000 people. There were multiple offices in the same city, and all of those offices were equipped with height adjustable desks. But guess how many people used them to work in a standing position? Almost nobody. So I have this hypothesis that there's a third issue at play here, the fear. The fear of what others might think of you, the fear of being a weirdo, maybe an outsider, the fear of being laughed at, pointed at, or ridiculed maybe. It is, of course, based on my experience and talking to some friends, but I really believe it really contributes to the problem. It's one of the major problems, and there doesn't seem to be any trivial solutions to it. It would need some kind of a cultural shift. And actually, as far back as 2007, we could see such an example of how such a cultural shift might look like. Because the owner of the company called Salo was kind of a fan of Dr. Levine's work, of Dr. Levine's research. And so one day he asked him for help with designing a new office in order to test out these neat ideas, bringing more physical activity to his employees. Dr. Levine agreed, and what followed was a 2-year-long experiment in which people worked in an environment like this. So not only everyone had a height adjustable desk, they also had treadmills under them. So while working on a computer, they could actually walk at a very, very slow pace. They also put some tapes on the floor and create some collision-less paths, to have walking meetings or to walk while talking over a phone. And Dr. Levine even set up a full-blown laboratory in order to track physical activity of the employees, and also measured, things like body fat, blood sugar, cholesterol, etc., etc. And the results of the experiment were quite phenomenal, I must say. Let's take a look at these benefits. So, for starters, people definitely lost some weight. They even gained some muscle tissue. All those health indicators mentioned before, they stabilized, they improved. What was also important from the perspective of the company, there was an increase in productivity, creativity, and even in financial profits. But all of this is not what struck me the most when I read about this. What struck me the most was this: increased happiness. Because, you see, not too long into the experiment, people started to become more active in general, not only at this new fancy workplace. So suddenly they started to have this energy to actively spend time with their families, to play with their kids, and to pursue and go after their personal dreams and goals. And they didn't have this energy before. And thanks to that, they were simply happier. So don't you think this is something worth pursuing? Dr. Levine definitely thought so. Just take a look at this quote from his book. A chairless revolution, uprising of human movement, will improve productivity, will enhance our happiness. Now, the sad thing about this, in my opinion, is that this experiment took place more than 10 years ago. And even though since then, quite a lot of companies, started adopting Dr. Levine's ideas, and especially in the US, it is by no means widespread, is it? And so, when I was thinking about it, an idea for a project popped into my head. And this project has a name now. It's called Stand It Up. Let me explain. So, I think that I actually believe that Dr. Levines is right when he says that we are at the verge of a revolution that will change how we work. But also, in my opinion, I think it's just not happening fast enough, this revolution. And it's for mine's sake, your sake, as well as our children's sake. So, the idea with Stand It Up is that we could try to kickstart this revolution or speed it up by starting and spreading this idea in our own industry, in IT. Why I think it might succeed? Well, we all probably know how the job market for IT specialists look like at the moment, right? It's very hard to find experienced specialists, and so employers are willing to do quite a lot in order to attract this talent and to retain it. Hence, all those benefits that we get. But I have something to say to these employers. Instead of giving us chill-out rooms with latest video game consoles, why don't you create mini-gyms for us? Instead of providing us free sweet snacks and Coca-Cola, which actually happened in the company that I worked for before, why don't you buy us these height-adjustable desks, or at least reimburse us for whatever sit-stand workstation we might come up with? I would even go so far as to say that we should work less for the same amount of money, of course, like 7 hours instead of 8. And we could use this hour to do things like, simple gymnastics, stretching, practicing yoga, mindfulness, what have you. Ideally, would spread out those activities throughout the day in order to keep the need levels high. In other words, yeah, you heard me right. I am saying that we should sit less, work less, move more, and be paid the same amount of money for it. And so in other words, I'm saying that we really should stand up for ourselves. We should ask for those things, those benefits, these kinds of benefits, demand them even, because in the end it is our health on the line here, and your employer doesn't care about your health, at least not in the long term. Because the brutal truth is that we are all expendable. Now, the irony here is that these companies might not realize that they are losing out by not providing those things. Because there's this opportunity cost that they're paying, which is about not realizing the full potential of their workforce, as the Salo experiment demonstrated. So let me just briefly tell you a bit more about this whole stand-it-up idea. There are basically three main goals. The first one is to raise the awareness, to educate by putting some valuable information on the web page or Facebook fan page, of course, but also, I think it's even more important, by reaching out to people directly, by showing up on meetups, at conferences if possible. Exact thing that I'm doing right now. The second, I would hope for Stand It Up to be able to facilitate this cultural shift. And I think the way to do that is by reaching out also to employers. We need to educate them all too, and show them that it doesn't really have to be, so expensive. And in the end, it's a win-win situation. And thirdly, I would hope for Stand It Up, to unite us, to provide some kind of a platform, whether online or in real life, where we could meet, talk, share our experiences and ideas for more physical activity in our workplace. And so we are nearing the end of this presentation. And the last thing that I wanted to share with you is, why am I even doing this? What is my motivation here? So you see, I've been passionate about computers since I can remember. I think I was 7 or 8 years old when I wrote my first program. It was in BASIC on a Commodore 64. And I think that even then I knew who I wanted to become a programmer. And so I did become one. And with that came countless hours of coding, right? But not only at my day job, also after hours. Because for a geek like me, probably for geeks like you, there's always just around the corner something new and shiny, a new framework, new technology, new side project worth developing, right? So I spend many, many hours coding also after work. And all of these hours spent, of course, sitting. Add to that the fact that I was also a smoker for many years. And if we go back to this, the beginning of the presentation, and we think about the years lost due to sitting and smoking, I am actually wondering how is it that I'm still standing before you. But joking aside, over my 10 years of professional career, I got to experience, let's call them nervous breakdowns, where I was totally burnt out, demotivated. But fortunately, I was always able to dig out myself out of this state, and this was mostly due to the help from my close ones, for which I'm really grateful to them. But the thing was that after a while, I always returned to old behavioral patterns, and the problem was returning. Supposedly, it was Einstein who said that the definition of insanity is to do the same things over and over and expecting different results. So according to this definition, I was quite insane. Well, you see, because the human body is a marvelous machine. It is marvelous because it can sustain and endure years and years of abuse, but it will break eventually. No doubt about that. And so over the years, my body was giving me those signals, but I was just, blind and deaf. Fortunately, it changed during this last breakdown because finally a switch flipped in my head, and I finally realized that in order to continue my career path, to continue doing what I love, I just have to, that is coding, I just have to change something about my life. I have to, start moving more. I quit smoking, and I also believe that it is equally important for me to quit sitting, to stand up. So I've opened up a little bit here, maybe a bit too much. I told you a story about myself, but is it only my story? Because when I think about it, a parable comes to mind, about the boiling frog. You might be familiar with it, right? So apparently, when you take a frog, a living frog, and put it into a boiling water, it will just jump out of it. But if you put it in the cold water and start to slowly heat it up, the frog won't notice the steadily increasing temperature and will get cooked to death. So now, let me leave you with a question that I think we should be asking ourselves. Could it be that we are all such frogs too? Thank you. Sure.
When we look at these medical studies, I always have a dose of skepticism around about the fact that what a lot large-scale medical study often does is correlate two things together. And often the people that make these studies then draw an inference that this thing causes this thing. And when we talk about sitting causing us to live less long, it seems to me that sitting itself could be a consequence of other bad life choices. And sitting doesn't necessarily cause obesity as much as obesity causes sitting. So I wonder if you've had the chance to look at these studies and decide for yourself whether you're accepting on trust that the causation exists or whether you think it's worth challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is very true. That is like the general problem of the scientific method, in which we can only build up and accumulate the evidence. It's really hard to prove the actual cause and effect relationship, right? We usually deal with correlations. Now, the thing is that the body of evidence for this link is quite large over the decades. I just mentioned one particular study. And when you also, like, for example, when you read the desk-bound book, you can, really make sense out of it, and it seems logical what kind of, havoc it wreaks in your body, the sitting. That's one thing. But to answer your initial question about this cause, so these studies try to get rid of these confounding factors, right? So, for example, this stratification, this grouping for inactive and active, and I believe in this particular study, you also cover things, like age, whether someone is a smoker. You can't really take into account all of the possible variables, but they do their best, and that's why we can't really depend on one study. We just have to accumulate the evidence, and if the result is consistent again and again, then we can start to believe it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I tried these before, but I couldn't continue using them because of the knees. They are a bit better than sitting for two reasons. So one is your core muscles now have to work because you don't have the back support. That's one thing. The other thing is that you're not contracting your very important muscles, iliopsoas, which is responsible for bending like this, right? When we sit down, these muscles get contracted, and this in turn results in body compensations in other activities, like simply walking, right? Your body has to compensate, like, for example, in this case, with hyperlordosis. So it is a bit better because, the legs are a bit more straight, and the core muscles are activated, but it's not ideal. And it's not zeros and ones, right? Someone said, I hate the fact that I don't remember who said that or wrote this, that the best position for a human body is the next one. So it's about movement and alternating positions. They're not saying that you shouldn't be sitting at all, right? But there are of course better and worse ways to sit. Yeah, I mean.
How many people who are sitting are actually also close?
Yeah, so actually I think that the brain is it's the most hungry organ within our body when it comes to using energy. But that's the lack of movement is the problem here, right? But also to get back to this previous thing about passive I think it's really important, this diagram that I showed, when you have two groups, of inactive and active, right? So they accounted for that variable. That even for active people, that they do some sports and physical exercise regularly, the trend is still there, and it still sitting. And the amount of sitting still affects your mortality rate. Okay, so I think that time's up. Thank you again.